Greetings. Today we're going to talk about some basic characteristics that define our culture today, what people look like in our culture. We started talking last time about evangelism and the models of evangelism that were just here a decade or several decades ago really do have to be reevaluated in light of where people are today and how we better present to them or share with them the good news of God in Christ. I'm just going to mention some generalities about our current culture and where it seems like a high number of people are. First, there is a very high level of biblical and theological illiteracy in today's culture. Even people who have advanced to receive higher degrees and so forth, oddly enough, seem to not know the story or to be confused about the story of the Bible or how to read the Bible or what the message of the Bible is or what the mission of the Bible is. And people do not know the story of the church. They do not know the long list of stories that have happened. For example, basic things. If you mentioned perhaps the name of Martin Luther, the great reformer of the 15th, early 16th century, many people might think in their minds immediately we're talking about Martin Luther King. And so many people just do not know the story of the church and all of the theological issues that were faced along the way, all of the people in movements, and just everything from fascinating to tragic things that have happened along that story. Another thing that seems to be widely true of people is that in the older models of evangelism, where Christians were typically concerned about life after death, people in today's culture are concerned about life before death. In most of the models of evangelism I grew up in, a basic question would have been something like, if you were to die tonight and stand before God, and He asked you where you should spend eternity, how would you respond? Most people in today's world don't think that way. They're just trying to deal with the big issues of life. They're trying to get through the day. And there's actually some good news to this in the fact that if you go back and read the Gospels and look at what Jesus talked about, Jesus talked more about what was happening in the day than what was going to happen after death. In other words, He talked more about the present life. This is actually a great opportunity for the church to recapture that conversation, to not just put it all on the end and say this is what is going to happen after death, but really to rehear the words of Jesus and be able to share with people in our culture, this is how you live today. This is God's presence in today's world. This is what Jesus is doing in our world right now and how you can be a part of that. So we need to move the conversation back from the moment of what happens when you die to perhaps what happens when you wake up. A third thing is that many of us grew up in a culture in which we could use a sense of guilt to move people toward Christ. For example, we would get people to concede or to agree, I know that I'm a sinner, there's guilt and shame involved with that sin, you need Jesus. In our culture today, it is not the guilt factor that is as deeply present in people as it is the doubt reality. People have a lot of self-doubt. They have a lot of issues with self-esteem. And we need to keep in mind that as we reach out, as we try to make bridges with today's world, although a lot of us were introduced through some measure of guilt. God is going to judge you, and and all of those things. Certainly, truth in all of that. The people that we are talking with today are people that are filled with the self-doubt, self-esteem issues, and we need to redirect the gospel so that it speaks to those very difficult and painful places of self-doubt and negative self-image, along with a negative self-image that many people have of themselves. No surprise with the next one that I'll mention, and that is that generally speaking, people have a negative image of the church. They see an incredible gap between what church people say and how they live. And people will not give too much of a pass in churches because they've seen it too long and they've seen it too often. And once that gap is identified, wherever it might exist, people tend to move on with life. They tend to go do other things. They tend to invest their energy and time and their money and their resources and their passion into other venues in life. And part of the great responsibility of the church is to be able to close that gap. In other words, that the lives that we live and the way that we act and the way that we speak and the way that we treat people become more consistent with the message that we proclaim, with the way that Jesus talked about we should live, and those sorts of things. But I think anybody would understand and probably generally agree that people in today's culture just have a very negative image of the church. They see the credibility gap, and therefore the church is irrelevant. When something becomes irrelevant, whatever it is, you just put it aside and move on. And so for a great number of people in our culture, the church is basically irrelevant. So it's easy for them to put it aside and move on to other things in life. They just don't see where the church makes a difference in today's world. Another thing that people are experiencing today is what is called multiple alienations. Basically what that means is that most people are living inwardly and outwardly in a state of alienation. For example, it could be alienation of home life. A marriage is in trouble, or relationships with parents and their children are in trouble, or it could be job alienation. Things aren't going well, or they're trying to manage doing a job that people really don't like, while at the same time search for a job that they would like, but there's just nothing there. There is alienation of neighbors. People are living tighter than they used to, in the sense that there's less square footage per unit or per person, per family. You think about high rises and how many different kinds of people live in a high rise, and how close their contact is. Even if their door's closed all the time, to get out in the hall, to get through an entrance or an exit or an elevator, or to have to live in shared or common space, all of that creates a high number of alienations. People living in cities that get larger and larger. One of the things that will happen with that is that the more people you throw into the dynamic, the more potential alienation there's going to be with other people. And so a lot of people in today's culture are living in multiple alienations. And for many of them, just one more thing to add to the list is the church. They are alienated from the church for whatever reasons. And they could be justifiable reasons, or they could be non-justifiable reasons. They could be anything from I have a bad experience to they're a bunch of hypocrites to I've been there, done that, it didn't do anything to me, to characters of the church or ways of expressing church that simply are not true. So whatever the reason, many people in our culture just have the church as just one more thing from which they are actually alienated from unless or until they need the services that a church provides. And that might come in the form, let's say, of a crisis. It might come in the form of I need to get married. It might come in the form of a funeral. I need to be buried, or a family member needs to be buried. So apart from places where people don't know, where else they can turn except for the church, there is a high level of alienation of many people in culture with the church itself. Another thing that people in our culture experience generally is that there is a lack of trust. It's hard to take somebody's word in today's culture. It's hard to believe that this ad is really true. And there's just a great deal of lack of trust. That's certainly understandable. And the church needs to realize, however, that in a culture in which there is a tremendous amount of lack of trust, the very essence of life in Christ is trust. So one of the things that we certainly need to figure out is how do we address the lack of trust that people have, and they, lack of trust even in their own families. How do we address a lack of trust to move them, to help them find full trust in Christ? And for many people, that's going to be a pretty significant step. I've already mentioned that people have a tremendous amount of low self-esteem, and the emotional and psychological impact that has on them, the feeling of worthlessness as a person, a sense of loss. People are not thinking, here I am made in the image of God, and what that means. They don't think that way because that's a biblical thought. That is a theological thought that requires a lot of processing internally and working out. And so when people are going through their lives and they are not thinking that they are made in God's image, or they are not thinking that there is a God who loves me, or they are not thinking about what Christ has done for them in bearing the sin of the world, and they're not thinking that after he was placed in a grave, he was risen on the third day, and they're not thinking about the implications and the consequences of the resurrection or the coming of the Spirit, and they're not thinking about the return of Jesus and the reconciliation of things. When you're not thinking about all those things that I just mentioned, now, I know that all of us who are watching this, we think about those things all the time. Try to picture your life. Try to take all of those things out of your life and see what you have left. Try to just take them out one by one and see who you are and where you are. And then try to imagine that the people that need to be reached, they don't have all of those things that we think about, that we cherish, that we embrace, that we build our lives on, that we have fellowship about, that we experience and worship together. You take those things out, and it's a lot easier perhaps to see that people's self-doubt, their low self-esteem, their low self-imaging is just rooted in the reality that they do not see themselves as people that God has lovingly made. They do not see themselves as loved by God. They do not know what God has done to them to express that love in Christ. And what an opportunity for the church to fill an amazing void as we seek to reframe and as we seek to rethink the way that we do evangelism. We need to be able to speak to all of those concerns and issues that people experience, and they live with that day after day. Can you imagine having to wake up to a life in which all of the things we just listed are not realities, or they are not right before you, or they're not right on your heart, or they're not right on your mind? Another thing that people in culture experience, especially in our time, is the sense of everything is out of control. Here we are in COVID, and the sheer out of control of this story is enough to bring depression upon anybody. And if there's not in your worldview, or especially in the people that we are reaching out to, if there's not in their worldview a God who has created everything, and everything was created good, God himself said it is good, if there is not a God who gets the ultimate voice of things, if there is not a God who is even present in the midst of a pandemic, he's present all around us, he's present within our world. If you imagine living in a world in which God has nothing to do with all that is happening, whether it is something like a pandemic, or whether it is something like a 9/11, or whether it is a political movement, or whether it is an uprising, or whether it is chaos in the streets, or whether it is racial or socioeconomic divides and clashes among people, or whether it's about politics, people feel totally out of control, and seemingly as if there is no way to get our hands around this. There is no way to bring some measure of control to this. And so, especially in today's world, when we kind of follow the news and we look what's going on, our sense of things are out of control just seems to go off the charts. And that is coupled by the reality that not only is the external world, what is happening out there beyond ourselves, not only is that out of control, most people live in an internal world, their private life, that is out of control. They don't know how to manage themselves. They feel like everything they have dreamed for is out of grasp. They feel like a sense of desperateness, a sense of loneliness, a sense of frustration. And when you put all of that together, and there is that kind of loss of control, and you don't see God in any of it, again, the church needs to step up. We need to find ways to articulate that, we see what you see, we understand how chaotic it is, and we know how difficult that is to live in a world that is so broken and that is so unraveled, and yet we have this grand story that brings it all together in Christ, that God is not a God who is out of control. He is a God oftentimes that, because we do not know how to trust him, we do not see him. And so we have a great opportunity to use the current out of control crisis of our world as a way in which we can help people see that God always has been, always is, always will be a God who has sovereignty, not in the sense that he's pulling the levers to everything, but in the sense that he prevails over everything, that his goodness prevails over our lack of goodness, that his grace is, as we sing about, his grace is greater than our sin. Finally, many people in culture, they're looking for a new door to open, and they just can't find it. It is like being in a very dark room, and there's a door somewhere, there's a door handle, there's a door knob, and you're looking and you're feeling your way and you're trying to find it. That sounds so easy when you have the lights on. So easy when you already know where the door is. But imagine what most people are going through. The lights are out. The darkness is deep. The loneliness is frightening. It's terrorizing. And they are moving along walls, trying to find anything that could open a door to a new life. Well, we know that Jesus is that door. And sometimes it could be that just as Jesus stepped into our dark world to help us to see that He is the Good Shepherd, that He is the light, He is the way and the truth and the life. We might need to be more forward about stepping into somebody else's darkness, but stepping there knowing where the light is, where the door is, helping people to find the door, the handle to the door, which is none other than Christ. So, I hope you'll have time to kind of, think about some of these things. And again, I wish we could all be here together. These are conversations that would be so meaningful to be able to have. But I hope we are soon getting to a place where, even though we can't put, 20, 25 people in this office space where I am now, that we'll begin thinking about how do we put people in our homes? How do we begin using our homes in ways that are safe in today's world? How do we share meals together? How do we have meaningful conversations together? How do we bring a friend or a coworker or a neighbor into that? And so I think these are really exciting times that we are just about to step into. And I'm looking forward to the conversations we can have that will help us to live out faithfully the gospel in the very times in which we have. So I'll look forward to seeing you next time, and hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.